Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. From the outside, Jill and Guilliano seemed like the perfect couple. They had met in their early 20s, both ambitious and full of dreams. Guilliano was a kind-hearted and patient man, someone who valued trust and honesty in a relationship. Jill, on the other hand, was deeply passionate, fiercely devoted, and perhaps just a little too intense. In the beginning, her love felt like a warm embrace, enveloping Guilliano in a way he had never experienced before. She made him feel special, desired, as if he were the only man in the world who mattered. But as time passed, the warmth started to suffocate, and the love turned into a possessive force that threatened to consume him whole. It started with the little things. Jill would ask him about his day in excruciating detail, wanting to know where he had been, who he had spoken to, and what was said. At first, it felt endearing, like she simply cared more than anyone ever had. But soon it became intrusive. She would check his phone when he wasn't looking, scrolling through his messages with an eerie calmness. If she found something she didn't like, an innocent conversation with a female coworker, an unanswered message from a friend, her demeanor would shift instantly. Her eyes would darken, her lips pressing into a thin line, and she would bombard him with questions until he reassured her that she was the only one for him. Guilliano, being the loving partner he was, tried to accommodate her fears. He explained himself when she asked, reassured her when she felt insecure, and allowed her to check his phone to put her mind at ease. He believed that in time, Jill would learn to trust him. But instead of easing her paranoia, his patience only fueled it. The more he gave, the more she wanted. It wasn't long before Jill started tracking his movements. She would text him at random intervals, asking where he was and who he was with. If he didn't respond immediately, she would call, again and again, until he answered. Guilliano tried to set boundaries, but every time he pushed back, Jill would break down into tears, sobbing that she just loved him too much, that she was terrified of losing him. She would apologize profusely, promising she would try to do better. And each time he forgave her. Then came the restrictions. At first, she would suggest spending more time together, hinting that she didn't like it when he went out without her. When he tried to reassure her, she would ask him not to see certain friends, claiming they were a bad influence or that they didn't support their relationship. Slowly, Guilliano's social circle began to shrink. First, it was acquaintances, then coworkers, then his closest friends. Every time he tried to resist, Jill would find a way to make him feel guilty, as if his desire for independence was a betrayal of their love. Eventually, even his family was pushed aside. Jill convinced him that they didn't understand their love, that they were trying to drive a wedge between them. And so, one by one, he stopped seeing them. The apartment they shared became his entire world, his safe space and his prison all at once. At work, colleagues noticed the changes. Guilliano, once vibrant and full of energy, now moved through his days like a ghost. He was constantly checking his phone, responding to Jill's messages as if his life depended on it. When invited out for drinks or lunch, he would decline, mumbling excuses about needing to get home. They didn't understand, and Guilliano didn't know how to explain it. He wasn't physically restrained, but he felt trapped nonetheless. One evening, after another exhausting day of trying to appease Jill, Guilliano sat alone in the dimly lit living room, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. He barely recognized himself anymore. The man who once thrived on independence, who cherished his friendships and freedom, was now a shadow of who he used to be. He loved Jill. He truly did, but at what cost? Deep down, he knew something had to change. But the question remained, could Jill change? Could their love survive? Or was he doomed to live under the weight of her growing obsession? What started as an all-consuming love had now become a fight for control. And Guilliano was beginning to realize that he was losing. Guilliano's alarm buzzed loudly, pulling him from the depths of his restless sleep. He groggily reached for his phone, silencing the noise, only to see 3 missed calls from Jill. His heart sank. He knew what was coming next. He barely had time to sit up before his phone vibrated again. A message from Jill popped up. "Why didn't you answer? Are you with someone?" Sighing, he quickly typed back, "I was sleeping. Just woke up." The response came almost instantly. "Are you sure? Send me a picture of your bed right now." Guilliano hesitated but ultimately complied. He snapped a quick photo of his disheveled bed and sent it. He knew from experience that refusal would only escalate the situation. Within moments, Jill called. "I don't believe you," she said immediately. "Your bed doesn't look like you've been in it all night." Frustration bubbled inside him. "Jill, I just woke up. I have work in an hour. Can we not do this right now?" Silence. Then a deep inhale. "I just don't understand why you can't reassure me, Guilliano. If you love me, why does it bother you to prove it?" His head throbbed. "Because I shouldn't have to prove something that should already be clear." Her voice trembled. "So you don't love me?" "Jill, that's not what I'm saying." "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew you were getting tired of me." He immediately regretted his words. "No, baby, I love you. You know that." A pause before she spoke again, softer this time. "Promise?" Guilliano sighed. "I promise." For now, that was enough to appease her. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of something far worse. The next few days felt eerily normal. Jill didn't bombard him with texts as much as usual. She didn't show up unannounced at his apartment or call him excessively throughout the day. Guilliano should have felt relieved, but instead he felt a deep, unsettling sense of dread. This wasn't Jill letting go. This was Jill waiting. His paranoia began to grow. Walking home from work, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. A shadow that seemed just a little too close. A car that seemed to drive by his apartment too often. One evening, he caught a glimpse of someone in a dark hoodie lingering near his building. By the time he turned to get a better look, they were gone. Jill's presence was suffocating, even when she wasn't there. It was in the silence, the unanswered texts, that left him wondering what she was planning next. The Polaroid of him walking to work had been chilling enough. But then came the second one, this time, of him in his apartment. The shot was taken through his window. His hands trembled as he stared at it. This wasn't Jill simply watching him. This was Jill making sure he knew she was watching. Another note arrived, slipped under his door. "You can't ignore me." His stomach twisted in knots. Ignoring her clearly wasn't working. But what was the alternative? That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the apartment, every distant sound from outside, made his skin crawl. He checked his locks 3 times before finally collapsing onto his bed. His phone buzzed. "Jill, are you sleeping?" He clenched his jaw and ignored it. Another buzz. "Jill, I can't stop thinking about you." Another buzz. "Jill, I miss you so much it hurts." Guilliano turned his phone on silent and set it face down. But the messages kept coming. She knew he was awake. She wouldn't stop. He wanted to believe this would pass, that she would tire herself out and move on. But Jill wasn't the type to let go. And this was just the beginning. The next morning, he was exhausted. He trudged into work, his mind foggy, every nerve on edge. Marco, his coworker and closest friend, noticed immediately. "Dude, you look like hell," Marco said, eyeing him over a stack of books. "What's going on?" Guilliano hesitated. He hadn't told anyone the full extent of what was happening. But as he opened his mouth, the words tumbled out before he could stop them. "She won't leave me alone," he admitted. "It's getting worse." Marco's face darkened. "You need to cut her off, man. Change your number. Move if you have to." "It's not that easy," Guilliano muttered. "She always finds a way back in." Marco exhaled sharply. "Look, if she's following you, if she's breaking into your space, you need to go to the police." Guilliano shook his head. "What can they do? She hasn't physically hurt me. It's just messages. Notes. Pictures." Marco frowned. "That's enough. You shouldn't have to wait until something worse happens." Guilliano nodded, but he wasn't convinced. Could the police really stop Jill? Or would reporting her only push her over the edge? That night, Guilliano made a decision. He started packing a bag, just in case. If things escalated, if he needed to disappear, he needed to be ready. He shoved some clothes into a duffel bag, grabbed his passport, and stashed some emergency cash. He sat down, breathing heavily. The walls of his apartment felt like they were closing in. Then knock, knock. His breath caught in his throat. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate. Not the knock of a neighbor or a delivery. This was different. This was her. His phone buzzed. Jill, I know you're awake. His heart pounded. He didn't move. Then a final message. Jill, don't make me do something we'll both regret. Guilliano gritted his teeth. This had to end, one way or another. The knock at the door echoed through the silent apartment like a warning. Guilliano froze, his breath caught in his throat. He had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, he wasn't ready. His fingers hovered over his phone, debating whether to call someone, anyone, for help. But he knew the truth. No one would be able to stop Jill. Knock, knock, knock. Deliberate, slow, a quiet demand for his attention. His phone buzzed. A message from Jill. Jill, open the door, love. We need to talk. He closed his eyes, willing himself to breathe. He had to think. He had to be smart. If he opened the door, she would manipulate him, twist his thoughts, trap him again in her endless web of control. If he ignored her, she might not go away quietly. Another message. Jill, I know you're awake. Don't make me wait. Panic clawed at his chest. He stood from his couch and moved to the door as silently as possible, pressing his eye to the peephole. There she was, hair wild, eyes intense, standing in the dim light of the hallway like a phantom haunting his every step. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. He needed a plan. He needed to end this. Jill didn't leave that night. He could hear her pacing outside his door, mumbling to herself, occasionally tapping lightly against the wood. It was worse than shouting. The quiet presence of her just beyond his threshold made his skin crawl. Hours passed. Guilliano sat on his bed, staring at the duffel bag he had packed the night before. He should leave, disappear before she could tighten her grip on his life any further. But where would he go? How far would he have to run before she stopped chasing him? His phone buzzed again. Jill, I miss you, baby. We can fix this. Let me in. Guilliano clenched his jaw. He had given her too much already. He couldn't keep living in fear. He had to take control. Slowly, carefully, he made his way to the door. He pressed his hands against the cool surface, gathering his courage. He inhaled sharply, then spoke. No, Jill. Silence. Then a whisper from the other side. Don't do this to me. His heart pounded. He could hear the tremble in her voice, the anger barely concealed beneath the hurt. She wasn't used to hearing no. He knew this wouldn't end here. Another minute passed before he heard her footsteps retreat. He waited longer still before checking the peephole again. The hallway was empty. For now. The next few days were a fragile illusion of normalcy. Jill didn't bombard him with texts as much as usual. She didn't show up unannounced at his apartment or call him excessively throughout the day. Guilliano should have felt relieved, but instead, he felt a deep, unsettling sense of dread. This wasn't Jill letting go. This was Jill waiting. His paranoia began to grow. Walking home from work, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. A shadow that seemed just a little too close. A car that seemed to drive by his apartment too often. One evening, he caught a glimpse of someone in a dark hoodie lingering near his building. By the time he turned to get a better look, they were gone. Jill's presence was suffocating, even when she wasn't there. It was in the silence, the unanswered texts that left him wondering what she was planning next. The Polaroid of him walking to work had been chilling enough. But then came the second one, this time of him in his apartment. The shot was taken through his window. His hands trembled as he stared at it. This wasn't Jill simply watching him. This was Jill making sure he knew she was watching. Another note arrived, slipped under his door. You can't hide from me. His stomach twisted in knots. Ignoring her clearly wasn't working. But what was the alternative? Guilliano went to the police. He sat in the small, sterile office of the local precinct, recounting everything, the texts, the notes, the photos. The officer on duty took notes, nodding along, but when Guilliano finished speaking, his stomach sank at the response. We can file a report, but there's not much we can do unless she actually harms you. The words echoed in his mind. Not much we can do. She's breaking into my space. She's watching me, Guilliano insisted. She hasn't made any direct threats, the officer replied. But we can suggest a restraining order. A restraining order. A piece of paper against someone who didn't care about boundaries. Guilliano exhaled sharply and rubbed his face. That won't stop her. I know, the officer admitted. But it's a start. A start. Guilliano didn't need a start, he needed this to end. The following nights were restless. Guilliano barely slept, jerking awake at the slightest noise. He kept his curtains drawn, but it didn't matter. Jill had proven she could get close no matter what he did. Then, on the fourth night, he woke to the sound of something shuffling outside his apartment. His stomach twisted in knots. He moved slowly, carefully, until he reached the door. He pressed his ear against it, listening, breathing, right outside. Then a soft whisper. "I miss you, Guilliano." His blood ran cold. She was inside the building. His hand hovered over his phone. Should he call the police again? Would they even come? Would they get here in time? Then a slip of paper slid under the door. "I just want to talk." "No, no more talking." Guilliano reached for the baseball bat he kept by his bed. His heart pounded as he backed away from the door. His breaths were shallow, his mind racing. A sudden knock. Then another. The handle rattled. A quiet giggle. "I know you're scared," she murmured. "But I love you. And love means never letting go." Guilliano clenched his jaw. This had gone too far. He wasn't going to be her prisoner anymore. His grip tightened on the bat. He had a choice to make. Fight back or keep running. One way or another, this was going to end tonight. The wind howled outside as Guilliano sat in his darkened apartment, staring at the door as if willing it to hold against the presence on the other side. His fingers clenched around the baseball bat in his hands, knuckles turning white. He had made a decision, one he could not back away from. This night, this moment, would determine whether he could ever reclaim his life. A soft knock echoed against the wood, gentle yet deliberate. Then a voice, her voice. "I know you're in there, Guilliano." Jill's words slithered through the silence like a whisper of something inescapable, something inevitable. "Please," she continued, her tone almost pleading. "Let me in. We can talk. I just want to see you." Guilliano closed his eyes, taking slow, controlled breaths. He had played this game long enough. He wasn't going to fall for it anymore. "No, Jill," he said firmly, his voice barely shaking. "Go home." A pause. Then the doorknob rattled. "You don't mean that," she whispered through the crack of the door. "You never mean it when you push me away." Guilliano pressed his back against the wall, forcing himself to think rationally. If she broke in, what was his plan? The bat in his hand was solid, but would he actually be able to use it on her? Could he bring himself to strike the woman he had once loved? A soft scraping noise pulled him from his thoughts. A shiver ran down his spine as he realized what it was. Jill was sliding something under the door. A note. He hesitated before crouching down, heart hammering as he unfolded the small piece of paper. The handwriting was neat, almost careful. "You're mine. You always will be." Something about the finality of it sent a shudder through him. This wasn't love. This wasn't even obsession anymore. This was possession. The next day, Guilliano did what he should have done weeks ago. He packed a suitcase. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing for certain. He needed to disappear. Jill's presence had poisoned every part of his life. There was no corner of his world that she hadn't invaded. His phone was useless. No matter how many times he blocked her number, she found another way to reach him. His friends had grown distant, unsure how to help him. Even his workplace had started to feel suffocating. He had caught her outside his store more than once, lingering near the windows, waiting for him. This wasn't living. It was surviving. That night, as he zipped up his suitcase and turned to leave, his phone buzzed again. A message. No name, but he didn't need to see one to know who it was from. "You think you can run? You can't. I'll find you. I always do." Guilliano swallowed the lump in his throat. He didn't respond. He just grabbed his bag and walked out the door, into the cold night air. He drove for hours, following no real path, his only thought being to put as much distance between himself and Jill as possible. Every so often, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights trailing him. But the roads were empty. For the first time in months, he felt a sliver of hope. That sliver shattered the moment he checked into a cheap motel and found another note waiting for him. Slipped under the door. "I told you. You can't escape me." His breath came in shallow gasps as he stepped back, staring at the small piece of paper as if it would lunge at him. How had she found him so quickly? Had she followed him? Placed a tracker on his car? His phone buzzed again. Another message. "I'm already here." A slow, crawling dread took over his body. His hands shook as he moved toward the window, peeling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. And there she was, standing by the street lamp, her face hidden in the shadows, watching him. Guilliano had always thought of himself as a rational man, someone who could handle pressure, make logical decisions. But fear had a way of twisting logic into something unrecognizable. Jill wasn't just obsessed, she was relentless. And she had just proven that no matter where he went, she would find him. So he did something he had never done before. He ran, not just out of the motel, but out into the night, leaving his belongings behind. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs felt like they would give out. He didn't stop until he was deep into the city, lost in the maze of streets and alleys, surrounded by people who had no idea what kind of nightmare was trailing him. For the first time in months, he felt like a ghost, a man without a name, without a past. And maybe that was the only way to survive. He kept moving, always looking over his shoulder, always expecting to see her face in the crowd. Because no matter how far he went, he knew one thing. Jill was never far behind, and she wasn't finished yet. Waiting. Guilliano had never been more exhausted in his life. Every muscle in his body ached from running. Every nerve in his system screamed for relief. And yet, his mind remained locked in survival mode. He had thought escaping Jill would be as simple as putting distance between them. He was wrong. She was always there. He had spent the last few days hiding in different motels, paying in cash, staying off social media, avoiding any place where she might expect him to be. But no matter how careful he was, she found him. Each morning, a note would be slipped under his door. Each night, he caught glimpses of her figure in the distance, standing beneath a streetlight, watching him. There was no escaping her. And now, he was out of options. It had been a week since he left his apartment. A week of sleepless nights, paranoid glances, and running from shadows. He had reached his limit. He had to stop hiding. Guilliano pulled his hood over his head, stepping out of the latest motel room he had rented. The streets were busy, good. More people meant more safety. He needed to think. He needed to come up with a plan that didn't involve spending the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. As he walked, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Did you really think you could run from me?" His blood turned cold. Another message. "You belong to me, Guilliano. You always have." His hands tightened around the phone, his breaths becoming shallow. He stopped in the middle of the street, looking around frantically. Was she here? Was she watching him right now? Then another message. "Turn around." Every hair on his body stood on end. His fingers shook as he lowered the phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at him not to, he turned. And there she was, Jill, standing across the street, smiling at him. He ran. Without thinking, without a plan, he turned and sprinted down the nearest alley. He didn't care where he was going, he just needed to get away. He could hear her laughter behind him, echoing in the empty space. Running again, love? He pushed himself harder. His legs burned, his lungs screamed, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let her catch him. The alley twisted and turned, and then, a dead end. Guilliano stumbled to a halt, spinning around. His breath came in ragged gasps as he looked for another way out, but there was none. And then Jill was there, stepping into the alleyway, her silhouette framed by the dim city lights. "Why do you keep running from me?" she asked, tilting her head. Her voice was soft, almost hurt. "I love you, Guilliano. Can't you see that?" He pressed his back against the brick wall. "Jill, please. You need help." She laughed. "Help? I don't need help. I need you." She stepped closer. Guilliano clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had no weapon, no escape, no one to call for help. This was it. Jill smiled sweetly. "Let's go home, baby." Guilliano had reached the limits of human exhaustion. His muscles ached from running, his nerves were frayed beyond repair, and yet sleep refused to come. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt her presence, watching, waiting. He had thought that disappearing would grant him peace. He was wrong. Jill was relentless. She was more than obsessed, she was omnipresent. She found him no matter where he went. The motel rooms, the back streets, the crowded bus stations. She was always one step behind, always just out of reach, but close enough to let him know that escape was an illusion. The city had turned into a prison, each dark alley a corridor of dread, every pair of eyes a potential spy. He was being hunted, not with violence but with something far worse, unwavering devotion. And now, after weeks of running, Guilliano felt the walls closing in. He sat in a dingy motel room, the stench of cigarette smoke and mildew clinging to the walls. His duffel bag lay open on the bed, clothes hastily stuffed inside, untouched. He knew there was no point in packing anymore. Wherever he went, she would follow. His phone vibrated, its hum sending a cold shiver down his spine. A message. "You can't run forever. Let me take care of you." Guilliano clenched his teeth, willing himself not to respond. That was what she wanted. Engagement. Attention. Proof that she still had control over him. But the silence was worse. If he didn't reply, she would escalate. She always did. A soft knock at the door made him jump. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. His eyes flicked to the door, then to the chair he had jammed under the handle. It wouldn't hold forever. Then her voice. "Guilliano. Soft. Sweet. Patient. You don't have to be afraid anymore." His grip tightened around the knife he had taken from the motel's kitchenette. His pulse pounded against his skull, a relentless drumbeat of terror. "I know you're tired," Jill continued. "I can feel it. Let me help you." He pressed himself against the wall, willing her to leave, but deep down he knew she wouldn't. She never did. Then the sound of metal scraping against metal. A key. His blood ran cold. The lock clicked. The door creaked open an inch, then another. Guilliano acted on instinct. He hurled the lamp from the nightstand, shattering it against the frame of the door. Jill let out a startled gasp, stumbling back. He didn't wait. He ran. Through the door, past her, into the hallway. His feet barely touched the floor as he bolted for the stairwell. He could hear her recovering, her footsteps quickening behind him. "Guilliano, stop." He didn't. Down the stairs, two at a time, shoving past a startled motel guest on the second floor. He reached the exit, burst through the doors, and stumbled into the night. The city was alive, indifferent to his nightmare. Neon signs flickered, people moved in blurred figures, car horns blared. He kept running, weaving through the chaos, desperate to lose her in the crowd. But he knew. She wasn't far behind. An hour later, he was holed up in the back of a 24-hour diner, hunched over a cup of coffee he couldn't bring himself to drink. His hands trembled, his heart refused to slow. His phone vibrated again. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. I don't want to hurt you." A lump formed in his throat. The implication was clear. She was losing patience. He glanced around the diner. It was quiet, only a few other patrons scattered across the booths. A waitress stood behind the counter, oblivious to the war raging inside his head. His options were dwindling. He could go to the police, again, file another report, beg them to take him seriously. But what could they do? She hadn't physically harmed him. Not yet. He had one choice left. He had to stop running. The plan formed quickly, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. He had spent weeks reacting, letting her control the game. No more. This time, he would be the one to end it. Guilliano left the diner and took a cab across town, back to the place he had once called home. His apartment had been abandoned since he fled, but he still had the key. He still had control there. He let himself in, locking the door behind him. The air was thick with dust and stale memories. He moved quickly, pulling out his laptop, setting up his phone. If she wanted him, she would have to come to him. And this time he would be ready. It didn't take long. An hour later, a knock at the door. Soft. Familiar. Guilliano. He swallowed hard, steeling himself. He had left a message for her, a breadcrumb to follow, knowing she wouldn't be able to resist. She was too obsessed, too certain that he belonged to her. Slowly, he unlocked the door and opened it just enough to see her. Jill stood there, eyes wide with relief. "You came home." His fingers curled around the knife hidden behind the doorframe. "We need to talk." She stepped inside without hesitation, and as she did, Guilliano took a deep breath. This was it. One way or another, this would be the last time he ever saw her. The moment Jill stepped inside the apartment, Guilliano felt the weight of inevitability settle over him. His fingers tightened around the edge of the kitchen counter, his pulse pounding so loudly he feared she could hear it. The stale air between them was thick with unspoken words, unfulfilled threats, and the undeniable knowledge that one of them needed to take control of the situation. Jill smiled softly, stepping further inside as if she belonged there. "You finally stopped running," she said, her voice filled with something sickeningly close to relief. "I knew you would." You were always meant to come back to me." Guilliano said nothing. He let her talk, let her move deeper into the room, let her believe she had won. His heart pounded against his ribs like a warning drum, but he forced himself to stay still, to stay calm. Jill walked toward him, reaching out as if to touch his face. "I knew you'd come back to your senses," she murmured, her fingertips barely grazing his jaw. "I've missed you so much." Guilliano flinched away. "Don't," he said, his voice hoarse. "Don't call me that." Her expression darkened for the briefest second before smoothing back into something serene. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "You're just confused. You've been away too long." He exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the counter. "Jill, you need help." She tilted her head. "I don't need help. I need you." Guilliano swallowed hard. "No, you don't." Jill's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "We belong together," she said, taking another step closer. "And I'm never letting you go again." The moment hung between them like a stretched thread, ready to snap. Then she stepped forward quickly, her hands reaching for his, gripping tightly. Guilliano barely had time to react before she pulled him toward her, her grip surprisingly strong. "Stop," he said firmly, pushing her hands away. She didn't let go immediately. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clung to him. "You don't get to leave me again," she whispered, her chest heaving. "Not this time." Guilliano inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay calm. "You don't control me, Jill." Her face twisted into something desperate. "I already do." Jill reached for him again, but this time, Guilliano moved away, keeping space between them. The apartment was small, but he maneuvered himself toward the door. He didn't want to argue. He didn't want to escalate the situation. He just wanted to leave. "Jill, this has to stop," he said, his voice softer this time, controlled. "You're not thinking clearly." She let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, I'm thinking perfectly clearly. You just don't understand." Guilliano felt the tension in the air thicken. He had to get out of there before things spiraled further. He glanced at his phone on the table. Too far. His keys on the counter behind her. He took another step back. "I need you to leave." Jill's eyes narrowed. "No, Guilliano. You're not thinking straight." He reached for the door handle. "I am. And I need space." Jill's face fell, and for the first time, she looked truly hurt. "You really want me to leave?" "Yes." The silence between them stretched for an eternity. Then, without another word, Jill stepped back. Her hands fell to her sides, her expression unreadable. "Fine," she whispered. "But you'll regret this." Guilliano didn't move as she walked past him and out the door. He listened to the soft sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway, waited until the distant ding of the elevator echoed through the building. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. He didn't sleep that night. His phone remained silent, no new messages, no missed calls. The silence was worse than the texts. Jill was planning something, and Guilliano had no idea what it was. The days that followed Jill's departure were the strangest of Guilliano's life. He had expected her to continue her relentless pursuit, to flood his phone with messages, to show up at his door uninvited. But there was nothing. The silence stretched, turning from unsettling to suffocating. At first, he thought maybe she had finally given up. Maybe she had realized that no matter how many times she tried to pull him back into her web, he would never be the man she wanted him to be. Maybe she had found someone else to obsess over, someone new to claim as hers. But deep down, he knew better. Jill wasn't the type to let go, and that terrified him more than anything. Guilliano tried to return to his normal life. He went back to work, reconnecting with his co-workers who had grown distant over the months of his isolation. He met with Marco for lunch, catching up on everything he had missed while trapped in Jill's world. He started going for runs again, breathing in the crisp morning air, reminding himself that he was free. Or at least, he wanted to believe he was. But even as he went through the motions, the paranoia remained. Every time he walked home, he felt eyes on him. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart jumped into his throat. He double-checked his locks every night, listened for any sounds outside his door before going to sleep. The fear had been ingrained into him, a wound that hadn't healed. Then, one evening, his phone vibrated with a notification that made his stomach drop. "Unknown number, thinking about you." He stared at the screen, willing the message to disappear, for it to be some cruel mistake. But another text followed. "Unknown number, I know you miss me." His breath caught in his throat. Jill was back. Ignoring her wasn't an option. Guilliano knew that now. He had tried that before, and it had only made things worse. This time, he needed to take control before she did. He typed out a response with careful precision. Guilliano, Jill, I need you to stop. We're over. You have to move on. The reply came almost instantly. Unknown number. We were never over. You're just confused. But that's okay. I forgive you. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He knew any response would feed into her delusion, but he couldn't let this continue. He had to find a way to make her understand. Guilliano, Jill, this isn't healthy. You need to let me go. I've moved on. This time, the response took longer. When it came, it was shorter than he expected. Unknown number. You'll see. A chill ran down his spine. He didn't know what she meant, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Days passed with no further messages, but the sense of unease never left him. Every night, he felt like someone was watching him. He began to check the security cameras outside his building obsessively, scanning the footage for any sign of Jill. He told himself he was just being paranoid. Then one night he saw her. She wasn't standing at his door. She wasn't lingering in the hallway. She was sitting in a car parked across the street, her face barely visible behind the tinted windows. But it was her. He knew it. She wasn't reaching out to him anymore. She was waiting for him to come to her. Guilliano knew he had two choices. He could call the police again, file another report, hope that this time they would take him seriously. Or he could confront her himself. He had spent months living in fear. He was tired of being afraid. So, against every instinct screaming at him to stay inside, he grabbed his coat and walked outside. Jill didn't move as he approached the car. She just watched him, her eyes calm, her lips curled in a knowing smile. He tapped on the window, and after a long moment she rolled it down. Guilliano, she said softly, like they were old friends catching up after years apart. I was wondering when you'd come to me. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to remain calm. Why are you here, Jill? She tilted her head. You know why. This has to stop. She sighed, as if he was being unreasonable. It doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to fight me anymore. I'm not fighting you, he said, his voice firm. I just want my life back. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Your life is with me, Guilliano. It always has been. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He had been prepared for denial, for obsession, but this was something deeper. Something unshakable. Jill, he said, his voice quieter now. You need to move on. Her expression didn't change. I don't want to. A lump formed in his throat. You have to. She studied him for a long time, then finally nodded. Okay. It was too easy. Too sudden. Okay, he repeated. Jill's smile widened. I'll move on. Then, before he could react, she leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. But you'll come back to me. Guilliano took a step back. No, I won't. Jill's eyes gleamed with something unreadable. We'll see. With that, she rolled the window up and drove away, disappearing into the night. Guilliano stood there, his heart pounding, the city buzzing around him. It should have been over. But he knew Jill, and something told him she wasn't done yet. Jill was gone. Or at least, that's what Guilliano told himself. But the weight of her presence still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Even though she had driven away that night with her cryptic words, he knew better than to believe she was truly finished with him. The following days passed in an eerie quiet. No calls, no texts, no signs of her car parked outside his building. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the first whispers of normalcy creeping back into his life. But normalcy, he had learned, was a fragile illusion. On the fourth day after Jill's disappearance, Guilliano awoke to a strange sound outside his apartment door. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a remnant of the fear that had been imprinted into his subconscious over the past months. But as he listened closer, he heard it again, a soft scraping noise. He sat up slowly, his pulse quickening. He checked the time, 3:47 a.m. Who would be outside his door at this hour? He moved as quietly as possible, stepping towards the door with bated breath. When he finally reached it, he leaned forward and looked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty, silent. His fingers hovered over the lock, debating whether to open the door. But then, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision made him freeze. Something had been there. Something had just moved out of sight. His stomach twisted. He took a slow, careful step back, his heart hammering against his ribs. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was her. The next morning, Guilliano forced himself to go about his routine as if nothing had happened. He went to work, exchanged pleasantries with his coworkers, even met up with Marco for coffee. But the entire time he felt like he was being watched. Every time he turned a corner, every time he glanced out a window, he expected to see her standing there. But she wasn't. By the time he got home that evening, exhaustion weighed on him like a heavy blanket. He dropped his keys on the counter, kicked off his shoes, and collapsed onto the couch. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to close his eyes. He drifted between wakefulness and sleep, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Then, a knock at the door. His eyes snapped open. His heart leaped into his throat. Not again. He sat up slowly, staring at the door as if willing it to disappear. The knock came again, gentle, patient, almost hesitant. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, he already knew. With slow, deliberate steps, he walked to the door and pressed his eye to the peephole. Jill, standing there, hands clasped together, her head slightly tilted, eyes filled with something unreadable. Guilliano's breath hitched. He clenched his jaw, willing himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to let her back in. Not this time. Then she spoke. I just want to talk. Her voice was soft, almost pleading. But Guilliano had heard it before. The deception. The manipulation. He wasn't falling for it again. He stayed silent. I know you're there. Silence stretched between them. His fingers hovered over the lock, but he didn't move. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Jill let out a long sigh. Fine, she whispered. I'll wait. Guilliano swallowed hard. His pulse pounded in his ears. He didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare make a sound. He waited for her to leave. But she never did. The next morning, Guilliano hesitated before opening the door. When he finally did, he was met with an empty hallway. No sign of Jill. But something was waiting for him. A single white envelope placed neatly on the floor in front of his door. His name written in delicate script. He picked it up with trembling fingers, his stomach twisting as he slid the letter out and unfolded it. 3 simple words were scrawled across the page. I'm still here. Guilliano held the note in his hands for a long time, his fingers trembling slightly as he reread the words over and over again. I'm still here. He swallowed, his throat dry. He had known Jill wouldn't let go so easily, but seeing those words in her delicate handwriting sent a fresh wave of unease through his entire body. She wasn't just watching, she was letting him know she was watching. She wanted him to feel her presence, even if she wasn't physically there. That was the worst part. She didn't need to knock on his door or flood his phone with messages anymore. She had learned a new tactic. She was making him paranoid. Guilliano took the letter and stuffed it into a drawer, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled into his bones. He needed to go about his day as if everything was normal. If he gave in to the fear, she would win. He refused to let that happen. He showered, got dressed, and headed out. The city was alive with movement, cars honking, people talking, the usual hustle and bustle that should have made him feel safe. But it didn't. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, he expected to see her. Every time he passed by a reflective surface, he braced himself to catch a glimpse of her standing in the background. He didn't, but that didn't stop the fear from creeping in. She was still here. Somewhere. By the time he made it to work, Marco was already there, waiting for him at the counter of the bookstore. Dude, you look awful, Marco said, frowning as he took in Guilliano's appearance. Are you sleeping at all? Guilliano forced a weak smile. Not really. Marco sighed, leaning against the counter. Still her. Guilliano nodded, not trusting himself to say anything more. Marco ran a hand through his hair. Man, this isn't normal. You need to do something before she drives you insane. I know, Guilliano muttered. I just don't know what. Marco hesitated, then lowered his voice. Maybe you should leave for a while. Get out of the city. Go somewhere she won't find you. The thought had crossed his mind more than once. But something told him it wouldn't matter where he went. Jill would always find him. That night, Guilliano barely made it through the door before exhaustion overtook him. He dropped onto the couch, running a hand down his face. He hadn't checked his phone all day, afraid of what messages might be waiting for him. He finally mustered the courage to look. One new message. Unknown number. Did you miss me today? His stomach twisted. He deleted the message immediately, tossing his phone onto the coffee table. He wasn't going to respond. He wasn't going to play into her game. He leaned back against the couch, exhaling slowly. He needed a plan. Something had to change. This couldn't go on forever. Then, a faint rustling noise. Guilliano sat up straight, his heart pounding in his ears. It had come from the window. He turned his head slowly, barely breathing, and his blood ran cold. Outside, standing on the sidewalk beneath the dim glow of a street lamp, was Jill. Watching him, waiting. Guilliano's breath hitched as he locked eyes with Jill through the window. She didn't move. She didn't wave or call out his name. She just stood there, hands at her sides, her silhouette barely illuminated by the glow of the street lamp. His pulse hammered in his ears. His first instinct was to shut the blinds, to erase her from his view and pretend she wasn't there. But he knew that wouldn't change anything. She wanted him to see her. He forced himself to take a deep breath. He needed to handle this carefully. He couldn't let her control his emotions anymore. Summoning every ounce of calm he had left, he stood up, walked to the window, and pulled the blinds down in one swift motion. He stood there for a moment, hands gripping the windowsill, his mind racing. Would she leave? Or was this just another step in her endless game? The night dragged on. Guilliano lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every sound, every faint creak of the apartment building made his muscles tense. He had double-checked the locks, secured the windows, but it wasn't enough to make him feel safe. She had always found a way in before. At some point, exhaustion took over, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep. Then, bang, bang, bang. The pounding at his door jolted him awake. His heart leaped into his throat as he bolted upright, breathing heavily. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message. Unknown number. Open the door. Guilliano's hands trembled as he picked up the phone. He didn't reply. He didn't move. He just sat there, paralyzed. Bang, bang, bang. The knocking came again, more forceful this time. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. He had to think. What should he do? Call the police? Try to reason with her? Then silence. Minutes passed. The tension in the air was suffocating. Was she still there? Slowly, Guilliano stood up and tiptoed toward the peephole. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the doorknob, before finally pressing his eye to the small glass. Empty hallway. He let out a shaky breath. She was gone, or so he thought. Just as he turned away, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. You can't ignore me forever. A shiver ran down his spine. Jill wasn't giving up, and deep down he knew this was far from over. Guilliano stared at his phone, the glow of the screen the only light in his otherwise dark apartment. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to say. No matter what he wrote, no matter how he phrased it, he knew it wouldn't stop Jill. He deleted the draft and locked his phone, shoving it under a pillow as if that would silence the growing dread inside him. You can't ignore me forever. The words repeated in his head like a broken record. The problem wasn't ignoring her. The problem was that ignoring her had never worked before. If anything, it had always made things worse. The next morning, Guilliano went through his day in a fog. At work, Marco tried to engage him in conversation, but he barely responded. His thoughts were stuck in a loop, replaying the events of the past few days over and over. Marco frowned. She's still messing with you, isn't she? Guilliano sighed, rubbing his temples. She was outside my apartment last night. Marco's eyes widened. Did you call the cops? And tell them what? That my ex-girlfriend was standing in public near my building? They won't do anything. Marco shook his head in frustration. This isn't normal, man. She's escalating. Guilliano already knew that. He just didn't know what to do about it. That evening, he took a different route home, doubling back a few times, checking reflections in windows for any sign of her following him. It felt ridiculous, like he was living in a psychological thriller. But every time he reassured himself that she was gone, the paranoia whispered back. What if she's just waiting? When he finally reached his apartment building, relief flooded his body. He hurried inside, locked the door behind him, and took a deep breath. But the moment he stepped into his living room, his blood ran cold. There, on his coffee table, was a single Polaroid picture. Of him, taken from outside his window. Guilliano's hands shook as he picked up the photo, his eyes scanning every detail. He recognized the shirt he was wearing. It was from last night, which meant Jill had been watching. While he was inside, his stomach twisted. She hadn't just followed him. She had been close enough to take a picture. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. "Did you like my gift?" A wave of nausea hit him. This was different. The messages, the notes, they were bad enough. But this was proof that she had crossed another line. She wasn't just watching from afar anymore. She was getting closer. Guilliano gritted his teeth and typed furiously. "Guilliano, this is harassment. If you come near me again, I'm calling the police." The response came instantly. "Unknown number, you won't." His heart pounded. He clenched his jaw and forced himself to reply. "Guilliano, try me." There was no response after that. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. For the next few days, Guilliano forced himself to stick to a routine. He went to work, checked his surroundings constantly, locked his doors twice, and stayed inside at night. He told himself he was regaining control, that he was winning. Then on the third night, he woke up to a sound. Tap, tap, tap. His breath hitched. He lay still, barely breathing. Tap, tap, tap. The sound wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from his bedroom window. Slowly, with shaking hands, he reached for his phone and turned on the flashlight. He aimed it toward the window, and nearly dropped the phone when he saw the faint outline of Jill's face staring in. A strangled gasp left his throat as he scrambled backward, his pulse hammering. The second the light hit her, she vanished. Not running, not screaming, just slipping into the shadows, as if she had never been there at all. His phone buzzed again. "Unknown number. I just wanted to see you." Guilliano squeezed his eyes shut. This has to end. But how do you stop someone who refuses to let go? Guilliano barely slept that night. Even after Jill had disappeared from his window, the image of her face lingering in the darkness haunted him. Every creak in the apartment, every whisper of wind outside, sent fresh waves of paranoia coursing through his veins. He knew she wasn't gone. She was waiting. Morning came, but there was no relief in daylight. He sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his coffee cup, his mind racing. How had it come to this? How had he let it get so far? His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. "Unknown number. Did you sleep well?" His stomach twisted. He wanted to throw the phone across the room, but instead, he forced himself to take a slow breath. Reacting was what she wanted. If he gave her what she wanted, she'd feel like she still had control. Ignoring the message, he grabbed his keys and left his apartment. Staying inside was no longer an option. He needed to clear his head, to think of his next move. The city was alive, indifferent to the storm raging inside him. Cars rushed by. People laughed as they passed on the sidewalk. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby cafe. It was a cruel contrast to the paranoia eating away at him. He met Marco at a small diner. The moment he slid into the booth, his friend raised an eyebrow. "You look terrible." Guilliano let out a humorless laugh. "Thanks." Marco leaned in, his voice low. "She's still bothering you, isn't she?" Guilliano hesitated before nodding. "It's worse than before. She was outside my window last night." Marco's expression darkened. "Dude, this is beyond obsessive. You need help." "I don't know what to do." The words felt heavy coming out of his mouth. "She's always one step ahead. No matter what I do, she finds a way to remind me she's there." Marco drummed his fingers on the table, thinking. "We need proof." Guilliano frowned. "Proof? To show the police. Something concrete." Marco's gaze was firm. "They won't do anything unless you have undeniable evidence that she's stalking you. Right now, it's just your word against hers." It made sense. It was the first logical step Guilliano had heard in a long time. He swallowed. "So what do we do?" Marco pulled out his phone. "We set up cameras." That night, Guilliano installed the small security cameras Marco had bought. One outside the front door, another pointed at his bedroom window. If Jill tried anything, this time he would have proof. He sat on his couch, staring at the monitor feed on his phone. The small black and white images showed an empty hallway, a still window, nothing out of the ordinary. It should have reassured him. It didn't. He barely slept, his phone clutched in his hand, his body tense with anticipation. But morning came, and nothing had happened. Had she finally given up? He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. Then, just as he was about to leave for work, his phone buzzed with a motion alert. His stomach dropped as he opened the app. There she was, standing at his door, staring directly into the camera, holding a note against the lens. "You can't hide from me." Guilliano stared at his phone screen, his breath caught in his throat. The grainy image of Jill standing at his door, her expression eerily calm, sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through him. The note pressed against the camera lens was as much a promise as it was a threat. "You can't hide from me." This was it. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was making her move. He didn't go to work that day. Instead, he sat in his apartment, gripping his phone tightly, his mind racing. He had to end this, once and for all. But how? The police had dismissed his previous complaints, and even with the security footage, there was no guarantee they'd act quickly enough. His phone buzzed again. "Unknown number. I know you're inside." "Open the door." A chill ran down his spine. She was still there. Guilliano stood, his hands clenched into fists. He was done being afraid. He walked to the door and took a deep breath before unlocking it. As the door creaked open, he came face to face with Jill. She smiled, as if this was a normal conversation. "I knew you'd let me in." Guilliano held his ground. "This stops now, Jill." Her smile faltered, her eyes scanning his face. "Why are you doing this? We belong together. You know that." "No, we don't. You need help, Jill. This isn't love." For a moment, she looked genuinely hurt. Then, just as quickly, her expression darkened. "You think you can just erase me? After everything we've been through?" Guilliano kept his voice firm. "You need to leave. Now." Her fingers curled at her sides, her jaw tightening. "I'm not going anywhere, Guilliano. If I can't have you." He took a step forward, forcing confidence into his voice. "Then you'll have nothing." Jill's breath hitched. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he meant it. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway. Guilliano exhaled sharply, his hands trembling. He didn't believe for a second that it was truly over. For the next few days, he remained on edge. Every time his phone buzzed, every time he walked down the street, he expected her to appear. But she didn't. Then, a week later, he received a final message. "Unknown number. Goodbye, Guilliano. I hope you remember me." And just like that, she was gone. Months passed. Slowly, Guilliano began to rebuild his life. The fear faded, the nightmares became less frequent. He no longer looked over his shoulder, no longer checked every room before going to sleep. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, he would feel a phantom presence lingering just out of sight. A shadow in the corner of his vision. A whisper in the wind. Jill was gone, but she would always be a part of him.